Well, welcome to Africa of the Modern Era, Part 2. This is an example of fine wood carving that would be used. This one looks like it's a drum. If you look closely and you see the head on the drum. Now, we were talking at the end of the last lecture about the initiation ritual, that making a ceremony of the passage from childhood into adulthood. And let's look at another way that that might have been celebrated. The Nkanu people of Congo created these elaborate wall panels. Now this one is interesting because in the middle we have a British soldier. And then on each side, these are depictions that are representing the warriors, that are the actual children that are becoming men from the tribe. So here is a great example of how the introduction of the European colonists actually made it into art. Now these were made to honor, to commemorate the rite of passage of a young boy into adulthood, and were used as wall panels. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about how art is a connection to the spirit world. African peoples have been influenced by Islam and by Christianity now for hundreds of years, and yet the old customs and beliefs remain strong among the people. I mean, how do we answer the fundamental questions of why does this person die and this one survive? Why did this child not make it? Why did something terrible happen to someone and not to someone else? And in this belief system, many of the African tribes, that relates to connection with the spirit world. Generally, in this belief system, the supreme deity doesn't really mingle with the everyday affairs of people upon the earth. Instead, there are numerous subordinate spirits that are involved in all aspects of life. Would that be the god or goddess of the cornfield, or of Ogun, the god of iron, and etc., etc. So these spirits must be appeased through ritual, through prayer, through offerings. And if they're not, then that explains the difficulties that we encounter in life. Now, each area has its own set of belief systems. And now we're going to look at the Baule people. They have a belief that there's a parallel realm in which spirits live. And those lives really parallel our lives. So in the case of a person who's living in this earth plane reality, who doesn't really have an easy time maybe taking on the roles of life. For example, if a woman has not been able to have children, or a man has not married, then they will craft these spirit spouses, and they will pray to them to contact their spouse in the other world. You can see here that it's buffed to a fine sheen, which happens because these figures are touched and are worshipped often. They're also often given jewelry, like we see here. And this can serve many functions. From a purely psychological function, it's an outlet, hope. And from a spiritual or from the religious function, it would be serving to cause better fortune for the religious person in this world by contacting their spirit from the other world. So this is an Nkise Nkonde from the Congo people. These are interesting figures in that they really only came into use in like the 18th and 19th century, in large part as a response to the incursion of the Europeans. What these are is these are figures that are meant to represent the spirit world here on earth, and they were used often as villagers would be responding to a difficult attack or something. They would use these figures to contact the spirit world. Often they would also be used between warring villages as a sort of a symbol of the peace that they were going for between them. Let's look at a few things that are specific about this particular one. And I do want to note that it comes from a museum in Chicago. And when we think about its original function, well, I like to think about its original function in its context rather than thinking of it in the museum case. So here we have some things that are very specific. There's what they call the belongo, or that's herbs, medicinal herbs that are in all of these places within the body and on top of the body. Now, it's believed that the crown is where a person can have really accelerated contact with the spirit world. And here in the belly is the root of a person's power. So also, if you look closely, there's nails or knives that are driven into the figure, and they're supposed to cause it to sort of wake up and get its attention. Now, the driving of nails into figures, that was kind of popularized in North American culture, but again, completely out of context and a misunderstanding for the original use of these very powerful symbolic figures. One more thing to note is that this figure is standing in a position of readiness, as if it is ready to fight or wrestle, to take on whatever comes its way. Now, the number of nails in it means that it has had a long and efficacious life, fulfilling its function of transmitting power from the spirit world down into the earthly plane. In the belief system of the Yoruba people, the great supreme being, Olodumare, is too far above the daily workings of life. And so there is a whole pantheon of, you could call them lesser gods, that have sort of human characteristics. They're called the Orisha. Among the Orisha are two, which is Arumala and Eshu. And these two serve to kind of maintain balance upon the earth. Now, Eshu is an interesting one to consider because if you know coyote in the Native American tradition or the court jester within the European mythology, he's the trickster. Eshu is the trickster, which appears in mythology throughout the world. They usually guard the doorway, the crossroads. You would put Eshu in a place where you want to kind of ferret out trouble. So we're looking here at an Ifa divination session. It's overseen by what they call a babalawo, and that would be a priest within this tradition. And they put items, they put sand and cowrie shells upon the surface, and depending on the pattern that comes out, he can read that and do a bit of divination, reading it as an oracle. Oracles are something that we also find in spiritual traditions throughout the earth. In another form of divination, the Chokwe people of the Democratic Republic of Congo have all of these items in the basket. And when the diviner or priest or priestess seeks to do a reading, they'll cover the basket and they'll shake everything around. And how the objects land when the cover is removed allows for the diviner to foresee or foretell what is to come for the person who's seeking a reading. Way back at the beginning of the lesson, we looked at a finial from a staff from the Ashanti people in Ghana. And this was covered in gold, and it signified the wisdom of the person who was to mediate between the king or the ruler and the people. And here we have another object from Ashanti culture, and it's called a kente cloth. These cloths were only woven by the men. They're still woven to this day, but you can see they're actually woven together from very small strips of cloth that are woven in strips and then fastened together. This was worn by the man sort of wrapped around toga style, and they would be worn in two pieces by a woman. And in the Ashanti culture, the wearing of well-made garments or gold in both ornaments and in jewelry was used to signify power and leadership within the culture. This is something that we really see throughout the world. That honoring of a ruler's position through art and decoration can be seen in so many different ways. And here we're looking at it from the Kuba people of the Congo. And what they did is they have a ruler that they call the Nyim. And the Nyim goes back to the very first Nyim with the lineage. And each time a new ruler is initiated, is crowned, then they make a new capital city. Part of that is these elaborately decorated structures. This is the sleeping dwelling for the current leader. Now this same elaboration of decoration goes to the individual too. Here's one of the Nim. Here is someone from the Kuba people in their ceremonial dress. And you can see everyone has their finest garments on, but the very best is reserved for the Niem, or the supreme leader. Now maybe to unschooled eyes this would look a little over the top, but if it's part of the society and of the lineage of how they've been doing it for a long time, then this only represents an honoring of the royalty. Let's talk about these beautiful posts, shall we? This is from Alawe of Isa. This gentleman, seen to be probably one of a long line of woodcarvers, is really one of the most extraordinary artists in the history of art, and yet we know so very little about him. One gentleman spoke with him when he was a very old man, someone who's translated that into English, but otherwise we only have his work to show. And these are posts that were in the veranda of a palace of the Ogaga of Ikire. And what Alawe of Ise did was he carved these incredible elaborate posts, as we see here, and he also did roof lines and carvings of all different varieties. His work has become quite popular, and we'll look at another example. Here we have a beautiful example of these items as they were originally carved as part of the palace. There are posts actually holding up the ceiling, many of them, and some of them are just freestanding sculptures. So here's the man himself. This is the only known photo of him, and someone has sort of montaged it with some of his work. But he was truly the Michelangelo of his time and place. Here's another example of his work, which is a palace door and another view of that door. And let's go back here to see the same door is shown in this image of truly a master of the Yoruba people, and one of the great artists really in history. Now let's look at more masks, and as we do that we're going to explore funerary rituals, or how people honor the dead. This really varies throughout the world, but with the Kuba people of the Republic of Congo, they have a unique ritual, especially for the initiated men and people who hold high status within their culture. So this is an Ngeri Mwash mask, and it's an important part of the ritual. Check out how this thing is decorated. It's really amazing. Now it represents a sort of a female quality, and the person who wears this mask has an elaborate costume that goes with it. So upon the death of someone who's an initiate, there is this ritual that's held near their home right before they're interned or put in the ground. It's believed that the spirit of the person who has died will get angry if they're not honored in the appropriate way. So this ritual must occur. Now the same thing, if there's a debt that hasn't been paid, the person on the other side might get angry and cause harm to someone who's still in this plane. So let's look at two parts of the ritual. There's sort of a male and a female part. This guy is called a boom, and this is the more aggressive male part of the ritual. He has knives, he'll lunge at people. It's a very kind of exciting and scary part of the dance. If you look in the background, you can see a little kid that's laughing. He's very excited at this. So this is the more aggressive part of the dance, and then it goes to the other part, which is the Ngeri Mwash dancer, and this dancer has more lyrical movements, moving more as a woman might. So these two dancers do this ritual, do the dance, and then they put the person in the ground and have thus appeased their spirit according to the tradition. There's a fairly widely held belief across Africa about what happens when we die. And it's widely viewed that death is simply another transition, much as we're born, and then we're initiated into adulthood, and then in a way initiated into the other side of the world after we die. So, in some ways, this is similar to belief systems in the West, where after a person dies in this belief, they go through a sort of a purgatory, you could say. They're in between worlds, and they're going through challenges. Maybe they're partly here, partly there, and then they get initiated or welcomed into the new community. And that would be the community of the ancestors. This is why ancestor worship is so fundamental to most of the peoples in traditional Africa. We're looking here at the masks of the Dogon people as part of their funerary ritual. They hold a ceremony called a dama, and they only hold it, maybe every 12 or 13 years. And so they hold basically a funeral for a whole bunch of people at one time. But the ceremony is spectacular. It can last as long as 6 days, with hundreds of masks being used with the dancing. If it's a man that's being honored, then they have a sort of a hunting ritual on the roof of his house. And if it's a woman, they break her cooking pots to really make a ceremonial, to ritualize what they used to do on earth and what they'll no longer be doing in the realm of the ancestors, in the spirit realm. So the Dogon are actually a rather mystical and mysterious group of people in Mali, and we'll look at them a little bit more in the films this week. Now, in one more example of a funerary practice from Africa, we're going to talk about the Fang people. They lived on the Atlantic coast in Cameroon and in that area. This is a reliquary guardian. So what these people believed is that the actual bones and relics of someone who did great deeds in life should be saved and worshipped and venerated, and that there was powers that exuded from this that would help one in life. So after a person passed on, they would take some of their bones and some things that were very special to the deceased, and they would put them in a jar and put one of these figures on top. These figures served to be a sort of intermediary between the spirit world and life here upon the earth. And they took many different forms, of which this is only one example. But you can see how it's rubbed just to a sheen with oil that would be rubbed into it as part of using this in a spiritual practice. As African art has moved into the modern era, it's both adapted what's useful from the colonial era and held on to the old folkloric traditions. So photography was something that really caught on pretty big and early in Africa, and one of the most widely known true masters of the craft was Sedio Keita, and this is an example of one of his works from 1955. You know, his story is his uncle gave him a little brownie camera and he fell in love with it. He was a carpenter, but he really took to this photography, new medium of photography. So he set up a studio and took over 10,000 photographs, recording the lives of the people in Mali where he lived. And as you can see, he was a master at capturing the essence and the essential dignity of the people who he photographed. For our final slide, we'll look at El Anatsui of Ghana. And what this artist has done is he studied art. He was born in 1945, and he studied the Western tradition of art at a university in Africa. But then he decided he wanted to revitalize the traditions that were unique to the African people. But he's also a recycler. He uses bottle caps and all sorts of crazy items that one might think of as garbage to create his works, and yet they also are reminiscent of the textile traditions of Africa. So we'll end here with this perfect marriage of the old and the new, and as being expressed in a modern art form. This concludes the lesson on Africa after colonialism, and as always, thanks for listening.